Hello and welcome to another Sonic Lab. That's right, today we're looking at the Roland System-8. This is the flagship of the AIRA range. It is a fully DSP based analog circuit behaviour 8-voice polysynth. So this is it. It's a 4-octave keyboard. It's a sort of plastic case. It's not badly built or anything. I mean, it does feel to me a little bit like I would have expected it to be more sturdy or more solid or hefty for the pricing, as it's a flagship, but I guess it's in keeping with the kind of System 1 vibe. As you can see, we've got the same livery, green, as I said earlier. Apparently the designer is a big fan of Star Wars, so I don't know if that has something to do with it. Roland do offer alternative end cheeks. You've got a pair of wooden end cheeks, so the 8W and also the 8A, which is a brushed aluminium feel. This does kind of increase the heft of the unit a little bit, makes it feel a bit more substantial, but they'll set you back around $50 a pair. We've got a 4-octave keyboard, Velocity, though it's a short travel keyboard. It's a full synth keyboard, but it's got this kind of short travel, no aftertouch, which is a bit of a shame, not because I'm just a fan of aftertouch, but because when you've got a polysynth like this, one might hope that you get that extra expressive possibility, but sadly that's not the case. So more on the unit. We'll look at the System-8 architecture first. Oscillator 1, Oscillator 2, 3, Oscillator 3, which is a sub-oscillator, but it's tunable over the full range, so effectively it's a sort of limited waveform third oscillator. Mixer, pitch, attack, decay envelope, multi-mode filter and envelope, amplitude envelope, VCA, ADSR, and then 3 dedicated effects units, which we were hearing to quite great effect on that last patch. Additionally, we've got standard patch, sort of Roland patch side of things, so we can just do 8 banks of 8. Each plug out has, if I go into patch mode, each plug out has its own set of patches, so 64 and 64 and 64, 64, plus the performance mode, we've got another 64. I would have liked to have seen different colour LEDs on this, like one for the bank and one for the patch, but hey, you can't have everything. It comes with pre-installed, obviously the System-8 engine, plus in plug-out slot 1 we get the Jupiter 8 engine, which is based on the Boutique range, we believe, the 106, which is again based on the Boutique JU06, and then you can load another plug-out into plug-out 3. In fact, you can swap all of these out. These are just default plug-outs, so you can actually switch them round. In this one, I've got loaded up the Roland ProMars, which is a mono synth. And I think you were asking, do the mono plug-outs that come from the System 1, which you can load into here, do they then become polyphonic? The answer is no. And more on the way that the voices are split up. If you're in split or layer mode, essentially what you do is you create 2 System 8s, or rather 2 System 4s, because you get 4 voices per layer or per split with full effects engine, and they can be, in a patch, they can be, you know, as I said, they could be, if I go to edit the upper panel here, they could be one plug out on one side, another plug out or another synth engine on the other side. Speaking of which, we come back down to the performance mode. We've got a pitch and mod stick here with bend and pitch and filter depth for mod and bend, which is kind of cool. Another nice little touch is this velocity off button. Obviously with a lot of polysynths, certainly from the 80s, they didn't have velocity, so it's a very different playing experience. And of course we've got a JP8 and a 106 model built in, so nice to see that on the front panel. There's also an arpeggiator, input processor and vocoder, only a single LFO, which is something that some of you may be surprised at. Would have been nice to have more, but more on that later. And then of course we've got a up to 64-step sequencer here, which also has motion control, so you can control and record like filter cutoffs per step, so you get this sort of additional modulation possibilities, which is actually kind of cool. I guess you can think of it a little bit like the kind of core Minilog, that kind of things, where you can just record motion. let's take a look at the rear panel connections. We've got left and right as a stereo pair on balance connectors, which is nice to see. A 1/4-inch jack headphone socket, which unfortunately you haven't got a separate level for, but that's just the way it goes. Then we've got a pair of inputs, which can be run as a stereo pair, so you can run that as an external input into the synth, not external processing, apart from these input effects, which are quite useful, again, if you were maybe want to change it up on a song-by-song basis. You can switch it to mic or line gain. Mic gain, obviously, you'll need a XLR to jack adapter. That's for using with the vocoder, perhaps, or just running your vocals into it if you want. Then we've got gate and CV outputs on 1/8-inch jack. Now these are volt per octave, and you can adjust the scaling and the root note for that, so it will sort of match up with most of your analog gear, as long as it's volt per octave, of course. Then we've got a trigger input, hold and control pedals. And finally here, well, not finally, and here we've got SD card. The SD card's quite useful because it allows you to save patches, individual patches, banks, the whole thing, and plug outs. So you can actually, if you were maybe hiring one of these for a gig, you could save your whole lot onto it and then just load it up when you get there if they hard one in. But also, if you've got more than 3 plug outs, you could store them on here and bring them in. The actual plug out sort of dumping mode is really straightforward. If you've got the plug out, you load it on your computer, and then if you've got a USB connection, you just drop it in and transmit it effectively to the plug out slot you want, and then it's in the machine. The USB, though, does audio and MIDI. Audio is only 2 channels in and out, nothing more spectacular, but it does go up to 192K, and I think the internal resolution must be 96 like the other AIRA range, which is presumably why it does sound so good. It might work with an MX1, you never know, or the AIRA MX1 mixer. And then we got DC input for the wall wart, little power switch, and an earthing post. Here's this sort of high pass filter, silky string patch. Just sounds lovely, and the effects kind of really add to the whole thing. In terms of sound design, playing with this unit, it feels like a coherent instrument. You know, you start to make all of these sounds, you're into the effects, and you can get lost very quickly in that whole thing. And I think I should point that out from the beginning, because with some instruments, you know, you don't get that connection, and I found that I really did, and which I'm pleased about, because obviously the last flagship I reviewed, which was the JDX8, I just didn't find that I got that kind of connection. This has got that thing going on, and it really does feel really quite pleasant. I've got another patch here, which is just a stock preset, again using the System-8 engine. And it's got a really sort of nice, sort of majestic tone. I did a couple more. There's one I've got on the Juno 106, which is a modified sort of trumpet sound, which is what I used as the upper half of the beginning patch, and it's got this kind of, it sort of reminds me a little Blue Nile-y, sort of quite organic feeling. You know, it's nice to have the plug outs, but the System-8 engine itself is actually pretty capable. So let's take a look at oscillator 1. We've got all the usual suspects. This is just, we'll start with just a straight sawtooth. And we've got a nice regular kind of shape here, square wave. There's a decent amount of heft to it, and they're quite buzzy as well. And basically the way that it works is we've got this colour knob, which actually affects the initial waveform. So in sawtooth mode, this kind of creates a sort of doubling type of the waveform, which you can see, pulse width obviously. Pulse width is kind of nice. It doesn't go through 0, which is a shame. I quite like it when you get that kind of gap at the end. You can create some interesting and additional rhythmic effects. And then we got wave shaping on all the other ones. If we come back to the oscillator, we then get into the multi-waves, which is kind of like super saw, detune saw. Same for square, and then multi-wave for the sine as well. And then we get into variations, and this is a sort of common theme through these. Noise saw, this kind of weird square logic wave, and then we get into FM type tones. And then This is a vowel kind of waveform. And then finally, an 808 cowbell. Go figure. We get oscillator sync on oscillator 2 and ring mod. Also, I should mention there's cross mod here. So we get some quite interesting audio rate mod. If we go back to a regular wave here, and then I sweep the... We'll just take a look at the filter. That's just, again, a sawtooth. And what's nice about this is the drive level from the mixer does affect the kind of little bit of smudge that you get. So we've got 4-pole, 2-pole, 3-pole, 2-pole, low pass, then we've got high pass filter, and we can get these, if we go into a 2-pole mode, just see what we can get. Take the drive down a bit. We get those nice musical harmonics. Do like a 2-pole filter, and then again on the high pass filter, if we go into a 3-pole mode. But we've also got high pass cutoff like you do on the Jupiter 8, and then we get into these variations which are kind of bonkers. They're sideband filters of varying different sorts, which kind of sound really unusual. Kind of almost sound like flanges and phases, and that gives you all these other different filter types as well, which actually are quite creative. So you can get into some really weird places very quickly, which is what I quite like. It's sort of perhaps weirder than you might expect from what looks on the face of it a fairly traditional subtractive synth. So we've only got one LFO, which is not the best, but we can get key trig and trig envelope, and this will actually trigger the filter envelope, which is kind of cool as well. If I dial in a bit of... It does go right up into audio rates again, and we got a fade, and then variation. What that provides is this kind of... It's kind of like 2 waves, one modulating the other. So it's like having 2 LFOs, but one of them's modulated. So it's not ideal, but it does get you to some interesting places, if that's what you want. So I guess it's a compromise in many ways. I guess what we should do is take a look at the different waves for the different models and see how different they are. This is the System-8 sawtooth, which is quite a nice standard one. Let's switch to the Jupiter 8. System-8. They sound and look actually pretty much the same, so I don't know if perhaps they are effectively the same. Get to the Juno, and we've got quite a different shape. It's an inverse sawtooth for starters, and it's also got this kind of slight sine wave component to it, which gives it that extra, a bit more weight. The ProMars is a different wave again. So ProMars, Juno 106, hear that thump, Jupiter 8, System-8. So there is quite a difference between them, although not between the System-8 and the Jupiter 8. So, I mean, those plug-outs will give you those extra flavours if that's what you want. Another thing that was asked about is the condition mode, and this is a parameter that you set in the menu system. If I come out of menu, I hit menu, you can go through all the various different deep parameters that you want to edit, and I hit enter, and I've got condition. And what I've got is just a square wave here. The value to increment and decrement. Would it be nice to have a fader, because you've got to go all the way up. I'll just send, you can use shift to go up in 10, so come back down again. Sort of adds this little bit of detune and variation, and I can take it right to minus, and it seems to kind of make it more accurate and more kind of digital. So it adds this this sort of, it's quite subtle, but it does add this sort of variation in terms of pitch, and I think that applies to a lot of other parameters as well. So you can get this slightly more randomness, but it is quite subtle effect. So I think we should take a look at the effects now. I've got this patch here, which is a couple of waves. And I've got the LFO key sync, so they're all working as octave shifts. Now what I'm going to do is just start adding a few effects. So right here, I'm just going to add a bit of drive, or maybe a bit of phaser. Quite nice. Add a bit of chorus, or maybe a bit of delay. Oh, this is quite nice, this delay. One thing I couldn't find is an easy way to sync this. I think it has to be done via the internal menu system, which is a bit fiddly, to be perfectly honest. I would like to see shortcuts for some of this stuff. So anyway, this is a bit, or we can add a bit of chorus. And then we got this reverb, which does room, we got a time, halt, play. I'm going to go straight for the mod setting and turn it right up, and just so you can hear a little bit about. And it's quite a nice, it's not, you know, not quite as long as you could get, but you get access to some sort of really nice spaces, and there's a good selection of effects. And I should add that when you switch the plug outs, so for instance if I go to the Jupiter 8 we keep those, but if I go to the Juno then we get that chorus and also some additional effects here as well. So I think Juno chorus here, so let's get that sort of classic Juno. So, as I say, I haven't got my Juno working, but it sounds familiar. You get that nice sort of wide thing. Right, so now let's get into the sequencer mode. You notice I've got a little analog synth here. I chose the AIRA bus because the greens match, but more on that later because that's running out of the CV out. It's worth remembering that there's a sequencer per half. So if we're in patch mode, we can have a sequencer for the upper and the lower. Same, the arpeggiator doesn't apply there, but the arpeggiator can be applied to all of the keyboard, one or the other. We can also route the sequencer out to the CV out as well, or the arpeggiator out, or everything out. So if I just run this, we've got our basic sequence, 16-step sequence. Incidentally, before I start, I'm actually using the variation 3 on the filter, which is actually the System 1 filter. It's sort of more like the sort of transistor ladder 303 kind of thing, which is appropriate for this. So we've got various different modes. We can change the scale of the sequencer. We can run it up to 64 steps. And we've got various different play modes. We can just go backwards, forwards, or just key trigger. So I can press. So I can run it on a sequence, which is actually pretty cool. I can also, if I go back to play mode, I can transpose the sequence by pressing the edit display. All well and good. So, you know, that's as you would hope. But the other thing that's cool about it is, as I say, the motion sequence. So let's see what we can record here. So if I come back to this, I'm just going to hit go. Go into real-time record. So I'm recording the filter there. I can actually change the variation of the filter and the effects levels, the effects types, LFO speed, and that means actually it's quite exciting because you can record a ton of parameter moves, keep the sequencer going, remove the notes from the sequence and then just play. And all these automation points will just hit in. I've got LFO speed, filter, effects level and depth, So you can create these sort of massive modulation soundscapes that are just happening sort of outside of the normal synth architecture just by automating all these parameters. Actually a pretty cool feature, that. Now, if we get on to the CV output, what we can say here is if I turn down the waves, I've got the AIRA bus input coming into the input on the back, just into mono. And now if I press play, the AIRA bus is playing. Now you can hear that there is actually some delay and reverb on that, and that's because we've got a separate set of effects for the input processing, which can be system-wide or on a performance patch basis. So we can process external audio coming into different ways depending on the song, which actually could be pretty cool for playing live. One thing you can't do is sort of disassociate the internal sequencer from the voice. So what I quite like to be able to do is play the keyboard with a single voice and maybe run the sequencer so that it would only go out to perhaps the CV. Now, I've spoken to Roland about this, and this sounds like it could be something quite straightforward in terms of a software, but it'd be really nice to decouple the sequencer from the voice, because the only other way to do it is to split the keyboard, have one of the sounds all the way up the keyboard, and then use the sequencer on maybe the upper half with the split off the range to the AIRA bus. But then you're sacrificing 4 voices, which seems a bit of a shame. So I think hopefully they're going to get round to changing that, and that would make it even more powerful. What I've got is, say if I come to my patch, this is the patch I started with. I decide, oh, that's a bit too much. What I actually want to do, I'm going to edit the upper patch. I'm going to take the release down, maybe take the reverb off. I want that sound, that's fine. I'm going to edit the lower sound. That's too loud. Take the distortion drive off it. Maybe drop this down. Again, shorten the envelope. So now I've got this sound. I'm happy with that. I think that's great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write. I hit write. I hit performance, enter. Yes, yes, yes. That's written. Now I'm going to change to another patch. Come back to my performance. Oh, hold on a minute. That's how I left it, isn't it? Yes, it is. And that is the fundamental issue, really. Normally, I would expect when I'm saving a performance that I'm saving the state of the machine. But no, I'm just saving the reference to the patches. I need to save the patches separately. And then, so saving patch 1, patch 2, and the performance to bring that back as it was. And that's not really how one works. You know, usually I might be setting up things. I've got a sequence going on the upper keyboard and something else going on the lower, or I might have external MIDI coming in, addressing each engine separately on separate MIDI channels, which yes, you can also do, or change the split point. All of those things, I would say, are part of the creative and sound design process. But when I save it, that's not what happens. And it feels like that's a really quite a major oversight. Most synthesizers that I've come up against, certainly in recent years, when you save a patch, a performance patch, it just saves the state of everything. And that, I think, is quite a problem. I mean, once you get used to it, yes, but you only have to lose your work 2 or 3 times, which I did during the state of the review. I'd be working on it and go, oh yeah, I'll save that. I'll use that in the review as an example. It's gone. And I think, if at all possible, Roland should really address that. It's not the sort of functions that you expect in a synthesizer, you know, for this century, really, if I'm perfectly honest. So I don't want to leave you with the sort of sense that it's somehow inferior and that kind of ruins everything. It's a drag, but it's not the end of the world. And the bottom line is, it's a really good sounding synth. I don't care whether it's analog or digital. It feels like something you can really easily interact with. You can get a lot of great sounds out of this thing. It does all the classic poly stuff. It does some really weird things. You can get there very quickly with all that audio rate mod and those interesting waves. You can get to some very cool things. The plug out thing, yeah, it's great to have, but I can't help but feel that the System-8 synth engine on its own is actually pretty good. I think where it does fall down is the price. It's about 1,300 UK pounds. Dollar price will scroll below. It just feels a little bit expensive for what you get. When you take into consideration there's no aftertouch, the weight of the case, you know, it's not a sturdy thing, and also it's going up against some of the new analog polys, the Behringer, and also Dave Smith Prophet 8 has reduced the price as well quite recently. It just feels like, you know, it's not analog, so if that's a thing, it feels like it should be just maybe a couple of hundred cheaper, and it would be a kind of no-brainer, because all of those features add up to a lot of great stuff. The fact that you've got CV gate out, if they do give you the option to decouple the sequencer, that would make this a very powerful live performance tool, as well as being in the studio, and you can also access it directly via USB audio as well. I mean, I think really the bottom line is it's a great instrument, you know, end of story really. It's just, if you need those particular features which are really kind of important to you, aftertouch, whatever, then, you know, you might want to consider. But I would, if you're into synthesizers and synthesizer sounds, it really is worth checking out. Don't kind of let the fact that it's not analog fool you into thinking it's inferior, because it's not. Roland have done a good job on making a great sounding instrument.